Yeah. All right. Good morning, class. I think there's some folks out there that need to be chased in, but welcome to our Bible study this morning. We are going to continue our study of the book of Genesis. Yeah, hi. I don't need to put you on the spot, but I'm glad you're here. Have a seat anywhere you like. It's all good. All the seats cost the same. You can sit as close to the front as you want. Don, where is everybody this morning? Is it just a lazy kind of day? Well, as far as I can tell, you're physically here. And if you're anything like me, about halfway through class, you'll be fully mentally present as well. So like I said, we are studying the book of Genesis. We've been at this for a couple months now, huh? And in typical Pastor Mike fashion, we are going at a snail's pace. So let's start off with a brief review. Genesis chapter 1 is a story of creation. And Genesis chapter 2 is also a story of creation. That doesn't mean that we believe God created the world twice. It is a particular thing about the way that Hebrews would tell stories. And we see this again, even though it's written in Greek, but John is, of course, somebody who is Jewish, so he has a similar worldview. When we studied Revelation, we saw that several of the events are told a number of times, and I encourage you to think of it cyclically, but also to think of it as overlapping spirals, right? And each of the retellings wasn't redundant, because each of the retellings was had a different focus of what the action they were focused on was. There was a movie that came out, I want to say late 90s or early 2000s, called Vantage Point, and it was a movie about like an assassination attempt on a senator or something. I don't remember the details. What I remember about the movie was you watched the same events unfold like 3 or 4 times, but each time you saw it from a different perspective, and you had all of the knowledge, because you watched it, you had all the knowledge from the previous one. So as the movie progresses, you gradually understand the events in a richer and deeper way than any of the characters, even though you're seeing the same events play out multiple times. So it is with the story of creation, we get the story told twice. The first is told in a more broad way. Broadway? Where there's sort of a almost even focus on every aspect of creation. There's almost as much emphasis is put on stars and planets as there are on birds and fish, for example. And of course, mankind does get a little bit of a special recognition in that telling of it, but not so much as when we do chapter 2. Chapter 2 tells the story of creation, but with a very specific focus on God's creation of man and woman. And let's have a few notes on the creation of man and woman before we move into the next section that we review. So it says a few things that deserve our notice. Chapter 1, it says that, so God created man in his image, male and female, he created them, right? Which is to say that God created man and woman in his image. As best we can tell from the story of Genesis, God is not yet, as far as the history of the universe is concerned, God has not yet made himself incarnate, right? So a shorthand way for us to talk about that is, let's say God is spirit. That's a biblical thought, that God is spirit. So then how does he make man and woman in his image? It would be, I think it would be a short-sighted way to read it, to say, well, God has a nose, 2 eyes, 2 ears, arranged so, and that's why he made Adam and Eve look like that. But no, the image of God must mean something other than their physical properties, because God hasn't taken on any physical properties yet. Now, I do think it's fascinating that first God made man in his image, and then later on, the Christ, who is God, comes in the likeness of man. But we're not going to spend too much time on that concept today. When God makes everything in the universe, he does so by speaking his word. He says, let there be light, there is light. As St. John describes in the Gospel of John chapter 1, that word that is spoken is none other than Christ himself. Right? John says, all things were made through him, nothing was made except what was made through him. Right? So, as I pointed out to y'all a few times, we get in Genesis chapter 1 in the first couple verses, literally 2 verses. If you're willing to take John's testimony as well, you'll see the whole Trinity present at creation, which is marvelous. It helps reinforce the idea that even though the word Trinity doesn't appear in the Bible, the teaching that the Trinity, that the label we use for Trinity teaches, is deeply embedded in the narrative of Scripture. All right, so God creates all things by speaking his word with a notable exception. What's the one thing in creation that God doesn't make through speaking only? Man, right? How does he make man? From what? From the dirt, yeah. The name Adam actually sort of means like dirt guy. That's a little crass, but it's not far off. So God forms Adam from the dust or the dirt, and yet he's still not whole. He's a body, but he's not alive. So from the dirt, he makes Adam, and then what does he do? Right, he breathes his breath, or spirit, because it's the same word in Hebrew. He breathes his breath into the body that he has formed, and then Adam comes alive. And while I think that's a good, useful theological metaphor for us, it's also just a historical fact that that's what God does. By the way, often when we talk about salvation as being a church that focuses on salvation as the work of God, not our work, it's the same thing, right? God finds someone who does not have life and breathes life into them. He does so by giving his spirit to them. You'll also see that same pattern repeated in the book of Ezekiel, right? When he goes to the valley of the dry bones. Ezekiel prophesies to the bones, and they come together and they form bodies, whole bodies, skeletons, muscles, tendons, ligaments, skin, but they're still dead. And then he has to prophesy to the winds, to the spirit, and the spirit comes and breathes life into them, and then the army is animated. All right, so God makes Adam from the dust of the ground and breathes his spirit into him. And my suggestion to you is that the story unfolding that way and being shared with us that way, again, I think it actually happened, but there are a lot of details that maybe got left out. God kept the really important stuff in the Bible, right? So why would he tell us this story in this way? Well, one of the things I think that it shows us, and to ancient people, this distinction might not have been as important as it is now. Like, this is one of those distinctions that might be more important in the world we live in now. Adam has a special place amongst all creation, that he is both more intimately connected to the world that God made than any other creature. And you'll see that because he also gives him responsibility over that world. But he's also more intimately connected to God than any other creature, because God breathes his breath, his spirit, into man, right? And so you see in Adam a union of the created world infused with the Spirit of God. From Adam, Eve isn't made the same way, but she's also not made like the rest of creation. So when it comes to Eve, Adam is put into a deep sleep, a state that looks a lot like death. Now, for us who live in the modern age of surgery, we might say, oh, he was anesthetized, right? Yeah. I mean, there's a reason we do that to people before performing surgery. God's just, good at it. So he puts him into a sleep. But for our purposes right now, let's imagine that that's like the first death-like experience of man. He will not understand death for a while, and that's important in the story soon. But he's put into this death-like state. And then God opens his side. One imagines it's not unlike a wound in his side. And pulls from him some of Adam from which to make Eve. And what we learn from the New Testament is that the union of husband and wife is meant to be an image of the union of Christ and his bride, the church. God, who understands how all of history will unfold, has chosen to make Eve in a particular way to teach us something about Christ that Adam was not prepared to learn at that moment, and for a lot of human history, people weren't ready to see it. But we have the advantage of being on this side of the cross, and we can look back at it. Because I can think about another person who entered into death and whose side was wounded, but from that wound was created a bride for himself. Does that sound familiar to you? Right? Christ on the cross. Remember when Thomas was unsure that this is the truly resurrected Christ, one of the proofs that Jesus gave to him is, put your hand in my side. Don't think this stuff is coincidental. I also don't think the Roman who stabbed him understood any of that. Doesn't matter. It's not about the Roman. It's about God's plan and what God is showing us, even back as far as the first week of creation. Simply incredible. All right, so that's chapters 1 and 2. A few other notes. God makes it quite clear that man and woman are distinct. Both are made by his design. The pairing that God sets out is one man with one woman. He could have populated the world a whole lot faster if he had given Adam several Eves, but that's not what he chose, right? One man with one woman. We'll get to polygamy here shortly, right? Because we talked about it last week. They're in the garden. Oh, gosh, time is getting away from me. Okay, so it seems as though there are distinct differences between man and woman. And I don't think that we need to interpret that as meaning there is one template by which all men must be men and one template by which all women must be women. There's a variety of personality types, skills, interests, all that sort of stuff, physical characteristics, whatever, in any group of men, in any group of women, and that's all fine. Let's talk about, but also, God doesn't seem to be ranking them in terms of their value in his eyes. And in fact, in the garden initially, the situation seems to be very egalitarian. There really is no hierarchy in the Garden of Eden other than God as king. God is king. Adam and Eve are given all of the world to subdue and have dominion over, which is meant to be a cultivation for the good of creation, not an exploitation for the luxury of man. Fall into sin happens. There's the encounter with the snake, and his primary attack is not, it's not, how do I want to say this? It's not by saying a bunch of untrue things. He gives mostly true things, many of them questions, meant to put Eve in a state of doubt, which I preached about last week. Y'all remember that? So he has leading questions meant to put her in a state of doubt. And then he even says his biggest lie is, as Obi-Wan Kenobi might say, true from a certain point of view, right? He says, did God really say you die the day that you eat it? Well, you won't die. You'll be like him, knowing good and evil. Well, they didn't keel over dead the day that they ate it. So you could say, well, that's, on the face, it seems like he was right. And they do know good and evil after they eat the fruit. But in fact, they do begin to die, and the whole world begins to die from the moment they eat it. And it seems as though God had hoped to spare them from the knowledge of evil, which is what they gained, because they were surrounded by good. But like the fish, I heard this joke this week. It's not a ha-ha-ha joke, but, it goes something like this. Two fish are swimming along, and one says, whew, water's cold today. And the second fish goes, what's water? Right? They were surrounded by goodness, but with no contrast, that word probably didn't mean much. In the way that the world was created, nothing even died, right? The animals ate grass and leaves. That doesn't kill the plant. People ate fruit. That doesn't kill the plant. As far as I can tell, not even the plants were dying in the Garden of Eden, which is wild, right? You're thinking, well, carrots, right? No, it says he eats the fruit off the trees. So their ability to understand these things was probably limited. God understands this stuff. So anyways, they eat the fruit, and immediately they sense that they are naked. And naked doesn't just mean unclothed. Well, it does. Every way I try to define naked, it's going to be not this, right? They'd never had a sense of being naked because they lacked nothing. But as soon as they are ashamed, now they sense that they lack something. What they lack is the ability to hide. Now they need protection from a hostile world, which is one of the primary uses of clothing, right? If you're shipwrecked, alone on a desert island, you really don't want to run around naked. It doesn't matter, there's nobody there to see you, right? The sun's going to hurt you. Maybe the plants there will stick you with thorns and thistles, and bugs will bite at you. You need to get covered, right? It's not just about modesty. But those weren't problems in a world without sin. So immediately they try to cover their own shame with clothes they made for themselves, which don't do a very good job. God seeks them out. He explains to them. People often talk about what's happening as God cursing things. I don't know if that's the best way to understand it. God describes the curse that has come, right? So he says to the snake, these are some consequences. And perhaps to the snake, he is directly cursing him. Part of that direct curse is the promise of a savior, right? The seed of Adam that will be an enemy to the snake, who the snake will bruise his heel while he bruises the snake's head. I like the translation of crushes his head, but it's the same word used both times. So be fair about it. But again, as I mentioned, when a snake attacks, what kind of wound do you expect? Yeah, puncture. But it doesn't say you'll puncture his heel. Bruise it, because in the crushing of it is the wound, right? Wow, 3 chapters in, and we already have 2 allusions to the wounds that Christ will receive. Interesting. Okay. So he curses the snake. He explains to Eve that childbearing is now going to be difficult and painful. And to Adam, that the whole world is now hostile to him. And I would go so far as to say, he's speaking to Adam, whose perspective is just a dude standing on the earth looking around. He doesn't have a telescope. He doesn't have a sense of space or anything like that. We who read the story with a more informed view of the universe, I think it would be fair to say that what God was describing was not just the problems that Earth experiences. These are actually universal problems that we can see played out in things, with my little tinfoil hat on. I'm not saying these are theological issues to die on, right, to die for, but the idea that our galaxy or our universe is expanding. Everything's drifting farther and farther apart. Boy, isn't that a good descriptor of the effects of sin, right? The idea that everything is moving toward entropy, right? Like people will talk about the heat death of the universe and all that kind of stuff. It's not supposed to be that way, right? But this is what has happened now that sin is introduced. All the systems that were meant to be perfectly harmonious are now starting to decay. Genesis chapter 4. We got into talking about Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel. And, I don't want to skip over this. There's yet another point toward the sacrifice of Christ, which is as the Lord is removing them from the garden, he supplies for them clothes. And what are the clothes made out of? Fig leaves? Skin, animal skin. Which suggests to us, it doesn't say it happened in the text, but it suggests to us that the first sacrifice to cover over sin was made by God. And is it not a thoroughly biblical picture that God covers over our sin with his righteousness in the sacrifice that he made? It's all in Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3. All right, moving along. Genesis chapter 4, we get Cain and Abel. Oh my goodness. I can't do this every week. We'll never get through the end. Okay, Cain and Abel, they have already begun worshiping God. And the way that they worship is not ripping electric guitar solos. I'm going to razz the guitar player because he's extra. But rather, so they're not singing songs necessarily. Maybe they are. But the first primary act of worship, and it's being done within the first generation, is the act of sacrifice, giving to God. Cain and Abel both have agricultural careers, right? What does Cain do? Cain's a farmer. Yep. And then you want to go ahead and say, what does Abel do? Abel's a shepherd. That's right. So, Cain is cultivating the difficult earth that God has already told him it's going to be hostile. It's not going to work for you the way it used to. Abel, being a shepherd, implies that there's already a problem of predators. You don't have to be a shepherd if the flocks can roam free and be fine, right? When Cain brings his sacrifice, he brings some of the fruit of his produce. When Abel brings his sacrifice, he does so by slaughtering I don't know if it's sheep, some of his herds. I'm going to go with sheep. But, whatever. Maybe it's alpacas. I don't know. But he slaughters some of his herds. God is pleased with Abel's sacrifice, but not Cain's. And Cain gets upset about that. God's really gentle and caring toward Cain. He doesn't say, be gone, whatever, right? What he says is, well, I'm paraphrasing, in your heart you're not given the right thing. Why don't you go do what is right? Because right now sin is crouching at your door and it wants to devour you. But you can master it. Well, rather than address his own shortcomings, Cain decides it would be more expedient to just eliminate the favorite. And then by default, he will be the favorite. Maybe. Maybe he hasn't even thought that far. Maybe he's just full of feelings. So he takes his brother out into the fields and slaughters his brother. Not the sacrifice that God was asking for. I want to ask this question to you. It'll come up in my new member seminar later today, but I don't think many of y'all will be at that, because a lot of y'all have already been through it. Why was it wrong for Cain to kill Abel? God hadn't given the 10 Commandments yet. There's no law in the book saying thou shalt not murder. Yeah. 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 Yeah, as often happens when God calls us to repentance, you're faced with a crisis, right? You can either, admit your wrongdoing and seek to change your ways. That would be repentance, a change of heart and mind, right? Or you can harden yourself to God's call to repentance, which usually means pushing deeper into sin. It's almost never like a neutral. It's generally a crossroads. But the question I'm asking is even more fundamental than that. Do we all agree that it was wrong for him to murder his brother? By what standard? Why is it wrong? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So God is the sole authority over life. I think that's a great principle. That's a great principle. However, let me just challenge you with this. Would it have been okay for Cain to sneak in and take some of Abel's flocks without Abel's permission? Why not? There's no law on the books that says you shouldn't steal. And I don't know that the principle of God being the Lord of life solves that problem for us. I'm going to show you. When you think about the Ten Commandments, we tend to think about them as rules that God gave for how we ought to live. I don't think that's the best way of understanding God's law. I think the best way of understanding God's law starts back in Genesis chapter 1. When God made the universe, he made it with a particular design. Gravity works because God made it work. And it is God's law. And you can live in open defiance to that law if you want, but there will also be natural consequences. If I attempt to step off of the roof of this building saying, I don't really believe in all that religious nonsense and expect to walk on air, how will that work out for me? Now, is God being retributive, right? Is he being punitive? Is he punishing me for his defiance? Well, maybe in a passive way, but not really. It's just the world is the way it is, and then I lived in defiance to that, and then I reap the consequences. Sometimes God is disciplinary toward us. I would say that most of the time, that's the operation of a loving parent to a child. Right? When I discipline my son, it's because I am trying to call him to a better life and to prevent greater problems in the future by disciplining now, right? So what are the Ten Commandments then? Or any of God's law? Well, what they are is they are God giving us a description of a portion of how he made the world. He made ways in which birds are to behave and fish are to behave, and when they live according to that, things are best for them, right? So it is with people. And so it is baked into our design that we are to love God and to fear him above all else. We need to nuance the word fear, but we're not going to do that now. We'll say that for another time. And he made us in such a way that we ought to respect and honor the people around us, to take care of their life, to help them with their material properties, and even help them improve them if possible. So it's not that because of the Ten Commandments, theft is wrong. That's not the way of thinking about it. What's right and wrong is baked into the universe. And what we get in the Ten Commandments is God laying down on stone some portion of his design of the universe so that it's no longer subject to our feelings or our interpretations as much as that's possible. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's get past Cain and Abel. And to do that, let me wrap up the story of Cain. Even though Cain commits murder, which we all agree is wrong, and Cain probably knew was wrong for all the reasons I just described. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. The knowledge of good and evil is already out there, right? God seeks out Cain all the same, much like he did with Adam and Eve. Seeks them out. And he tells them about the consequences, right? Because of what you've done, the world will be hostile to you in a new and fresh way. You're not going to be able to make it as a farmer anymore. So probably you're going to have to be like a hunter-gatherer kind of situation, right? And Cain says, this is terrible. I can't bear this punishment because I'll be an outcast, and people will try to kill me for what I've done. Now that's Cain's thought. God didn't say that. That's already in Cain's mind, the idea of revenge. And God still loves Cain and says, no, I will protect you. I'll put my mark on you so that people understand that if they try to avenge Abel, I will bring 7 times the retribution on them. Right? It's supposed to be an idea of deterrence. Cain goes off, settles elsewhere eventually, builds a city, names it Enoch. And from him, there's a rapid rise in technology and culture. I mean, they start working bronze tools, make instruments, which means they've got some measure of luxury, right? They've got some measure of leisure. They're making music, and it's a whole thing. And then we get on to a quick fly-through of Cain's genealogy. And, it's so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so. And then it gets to, oh my goodness, I'm down to 24 minutes. And then it gets to a character named Lamech. And Lamech, I'm going to keep doing the because I can. Lamech is the only guy who gets any kind of a story. And it's really short, but I think it's potent. All right? Here's the story of Lamech. He says, he said to his wives, plural, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is 7-fold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. What do we have here? Well, first off, we get our first ever picture of polygamy. I wouldn't say it's presented in a positive light. As I mentioned before, we'll see more polygamy throughout the Old Testament, and oftentimes it's a compromise for difficult situations, but it's almost always messy. I'll leave that there for now. But that's not the big point I want to make here. The big point I want to make here is Lamech is so full of pride and ego that he is willing to take a human life. He isn't looking for justice, right? Justice, at least in a very basic sense, is the repayment of debt with an equivalent value. This will be enshrined in law later on as an eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth, which is a biblical principle. But it's worth understanding that biblical principle is not to say that you must extract an eye for an eye. The biblical principle is meant to limit this kind of nonsense. If someone has stolen from you $50, you cannot exact from them $100 repayment. No. If they've taken $50, then they have to repay you $50 and not a penny more. That's the idea. Because this whole thing of amplifying, it's why the Hatfields and McCoys have been at it for forever, right? Because rather than balancing the scales, it just perpetuates a cycle of revenge and violence. But so we have in this guy a distillation of the growing wickedness of humanity. I thought it'd be fun. I don't know if we'll get a whole lot of theology out of this next section, but I thought it'd be kind of fun. Genesis chapter 5 moves us away from Cain and goes through the lineage of Seth. Seth was the son who was like Cain's replacement. And I'm gonna read it, and then I'm gonna write some stuff on the board. Probably. I should have just done it with a slide to be more efficient, but that's fine. This is the account of Adam's family tree, or family line tree. When God created mankind, he made them in the likeness of God. He created them male and female and blessed them. He named them mankind when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. After Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years, had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Adam lived 930 years, and then he died. When Seth had lived 105 years, he became the father of Enosh. After he became the father of Enosh, Seth lived 807 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Seth lived for a total of 912 years, and he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he became the father of Canaan. After he became the father of Canaan, Enosh lived 815 years, had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enosh lived for a total of 905 years, and then he died. When Canaan had lived 70 years, he became the father of Mahalalel. You heard that right. Mahalalel. After he became the father of Mahalalel, Canaan lived 840 years, had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Canaan lived a total of 910 years, and then he died. When Mahalalel had lived 65 years, he became the father of Jared. Can you imagine? Mahalalel, Jared. All right. After he became the father of Jared, Mahalalel lived 830 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Mahalalel lived 895 years, and then he died. When Jared had lived 162 years, he became the father of Enoch. After he became the father of Enoch, Jared lived 800 years, had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Jared lived a total of 962 years, and then he died. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. After he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked faithfully with God 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enoch lived a total of 365 years. Enoch walked faithfully with God, then he was no more, because God took him away. Okay. When Methuselah had lived 187 years, he became the father of Lamech. Different guy. They have some similar names. Different genealogies, different guy. After he became the father of Lamech, Methuselah lived 782 years, had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Methuselah lived a total of 969 years. Then he died and belongs in the Guinness Book of World Records as the oldest person to live. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he had a son. He named him Noah and said, "He will comfort us in the labor and painful toil of our hands caused by the ground the Lord has cursed." After Noah was born, Lamech lived 595 years, had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Lamech lived a total of 777 years, and he died. After Noah was 500 years old, he became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. I know that might have felt kind of cumbersome for me to read all that. And it sounds like we just covered a great span of time, doesn't it? All these people living into their 900s or late 800s. I want to show you something. Now, the way we normally reckon time, we do BC and AD, although a secular culture has encouraged us to do like BCE and CE. And fine, you're still pivoting on the birth of Jesus, but we'll settle that aside for now. When you reckon years BC, you do it backwards, right? So, 10 years before Jesus was born was BC 10. So as the numbers get higher, you're going farther back in time. I don't want to use that method today because it's difficult. I want to count up from creation. Is that okay? I don't know what we want to call this dating system, but we're just going to count years. Cool? Y'all understand what we're doing here? So, in what year was Adam made? Yeah. So, I can't really say born, but to label we're going to call it born. Okay, so he was born in the year 0. Woo! That's exciting. All right, Seth was then born in the year 130. I've already done the math on this. If you're willing to trust me, we're just going to keep rolling. Enosh was born in 235. Canaan was born in 325. Mahalalel, whose name I just love to say. But not spell, apparently. Was 395. Jared was 460. Enoch, 622. By the way, well, hold on. We'll keep going. Methuselah, was born in 687. Lamech, 874. I know you're wondering where I'm going with this. Watch this. Adam dies in 930. That means that Lamech probably sat around a campfire at some point with Adam. Do you understand what I'm saying to you right now? Do you know who Lamech was the father of? Noah. Noah was one generation, well, nope. I got to go a little farther. Okay, so Noah was born in 1056. All right, there are a few deaths along the way here. So we got Adam dies in 930. Enoch doesn't die, but he goes away in, where do I have that down? 987. And then Seth dies in 1042. So Adam and Seth have died before Noah's born. Enosh is still alive. Why did I do this? Why did I bring all this up? Well, a couple things. Obviously, a lot of secular scholars will tell you that this is fanciful. People didn't live 900-something years. To which I would say, that's like your opinion, man. But as we'll see when we get into the next story, the world before the flood is fundamentally different than the world after the flood. And all of the evidence and science that we have is based on observing a post-flood world. I can't tell you specifically what characteristics might have made a difference, but it does not in any way cause me angst to say, yeah, maybe before the flood people lived a really long time. Maybe under different conditions. And those conditions maybe are just genetic, right? I mean, like maybe over time, people's bodies just kind of get less good. But I think environmentally, there's also a lot of differences, and we don't know how to account for those because this is the only world we've ever had. Or maybe it was a supernatural thing. Maybe God just said, you know what? I'm cutting you off. We're just not doing it that way anymore. That is, in fact, the way that the story is going to read. But I just kind of wonder if that's a description of what God did in the changes that he brought with the flood. Don't know. I guarantee you the people to whom the story was given by God didn't understand things like cell decay or cancer or mutation. So any of those thoughts wouldn't have made any. They definitely didn't understand UV radiation and So for God to say, well, yeah, this is the moment in which I said 120 years is going to be the upper bound. That's fine. Those two things aren't in conflict necessarily. Anyways, but the reason that I want to do this, the reason I want to show this to you is because, if a secular scholar says, well, that's just fantasy because people can't live that long, okay, you shrug, you walk away. But one of the big criticisms that the Bible often has is the distance between the events and our record of them. Which from an archaeological standpoint, the Bible is really good. Really, really good. It's better than anything else we have in terms of the distance from the writing to the reception. But you might think, yeah, but okay, fine, to Moses, great, but who was there in the Garden of Eden? Well, Noah, who survives the flood, would have heard it from the grandkid of the person who was there. Also worth noting, in a pre-literate world, and I don't know if they were strictly pre-literate, because they're pretty advanced already, but we don't have necessarily their writings. But in the ancient world, there's no Netflix, right? There's no apps to keep you busy. You know what you do when the sun goes down and you're winding down your day? You tell stories, yeah. I'm going to give you a little bit of caution about this and later genealogies as well. Sometimes people will try to fix a date to the world based on doing math from the genealogies of the Bible. I would give you a word of caution about that. I'm not saying strictly they're wrong, but I am saying that the genealogies recorded are not done with the intention of putting a date on the world. As you can see in these genealogies, so-and-so was born, oh yeah, other sons and daughters as well. We know that genealogies are laid out because of keeping track of the important characters in the lineage. Not necessarily for the sake of a scientific or historical tracking of the years of things. But I did think this was interesting in the sense that this does seem to be a worthwhile exercise. I'll just put it that way. And the dates are listed in the way that they are listed in a way that I think makes this a compelling structure. But as a general rule, I feel like this is pretty reliable, but I wouldn't want to try and fix a date to the planet based on the family records. I don't want to call into question the truth of the Bible, but it's also worth knowing that the text needs to be used in the way it's intended. Just like we don't use Genesis chapter 1 to fill out our understanding of the shape of a solar system. And if you do, you're misusing the text. All right? Okay, I think that's going to have to be it for today. I'm sorry we didn't cover, well, I guess technically we did a whole chapter, so. But next week we'll get into the actual story of Noah and some really wacky stuff. Possibly right before the flood. Possibly wacky stuff. So we got church starting in about 8 minutes, so stick around.